Discover the lost metallurgical secret behind Viking swords that bent nearly double without breaking, a feat modern engineers still struggle to replicate.
Chapter 1: The Unbroken Curve. The story begins in the absolutely silent, strictly climate-controlled, monumental corridors of the Danish National Museum in Copenhagen, where time seems to stop and history breathes with the steady, cool rhythm of modern ventilation systems. The air in this place is thick with sterility, saturated with the almost imperceptible but omnipresent smell of preservatives, ozone from powerful filters, and cool 100-year-old marble that lines the floors of this temple of human memory. The lighting here has been designed with clinical precision, casting a cool blue-gray light that ruthlessly exposes every detail of the artifacts gathered here, while drowning in deep charcoal-like shadows in the far corners of the vast room. The exhibition, through which your eyes slowly move, is a collection of pristine, perfectly preserved relics of the Viking era. Here we see magnificent straight swords, perfectly proportioned, their pommels inlaid with intricate geometric patterns of silver and copper, gleaming in the cool light like evidence of ancient brutal glory frozen in time. There are powerful axes with wide blades made for splitting oak shields, as well as delicate filigree jewelry that testifies to the surprising aesthetic sensitivity of these supposed northern barbarians. Each of these objects is a triumph of modern conservation, rescued from the shadows of the earth and restored to an almost factory-new state, standing proudly behind thick sheets of bulletproof glass, completely free of flaws. However, this sterile, safe environment, this analytical, emotionless glow, is only a sharp, carefully considered contrast to the main point of this exhibition, to an object that by its very presence in this place seems to disturb the basic laws of physics, logic, and our knowledge of materials. This entire choreographed space, with its geometric order and the quiet hum of air conditioners maintaining a perfect 20 degrees Celsius, is only a stage on which a cognitive drama is about to unfold, a clash of modern, self-confident science with an inexplicable mystery that has survived over a millennium in the silent darkness of a Scandinavian peat bog. The atmosphere is tense with unspoken expectation, and each step on the polished stone seems to echo off the walls, reminding us of the gigantic gulf of time that separates the people who enter this elite hall from those nameless masters who forged the objects on display here from raw iron, coal, and their own sweat.
At the center of this modern sanctuary, like a storm god trapped in a cage of glass and light, rests an anomaly. The camera of our gaze, moving away from the shiny, pristine blades in the neighboring display cases, focuses on one isolated pedestal, illuminated by a sharp, almost theatrical beam of light that creates deep chiaroscuro contrasts on the surface of the artifact. There lies a sword from the period between the 800th and the 1000th AD, recovered from the anoxic depths of a peat bog that preserved it with macabre precision, preserving not only a form, but also a structure that should never have survived in this shape. Unlike the heroic, straight as an arrow and mirror-polished weapons around, this weapon was deliberately displayed exactly in the condition in which it was given to the earth. The blade, grown from raw carbon steel, is bent, distorted, forced to take the form of an almost perfect, terrifyingly even semicircle, resembling a bow stretched to the limit rather than a deadly close combat tool. Light glides across his surface, bringing out earthy tones from the darkness, deep rusts, charcoal blacks, and saturated peaty browns that create a map on his skin of centuries spent under water and moss. This curvature is not the result of the slow bending of the geological layers under the weight, nor is it the result of a fire that would melt the metal into a shapeless mass, nor is it the brutal destruction inflicted by an excavator during an accidental discovery. The geometry of this bend is too perfect, too continuous, emanating a hidden, dormant kinetic energy, as if the sword was fighting against invisible bonds at every second, ready to straighten itself in a split second with a destructive force that whistles through the air, cutting through the very glass of the display case. This sense of suspended violence, frozen in time of impossibility, catches the eye of anyone who looks at it, evoking an instinctive uneasiness.
Before this architecturally exposed conundrum stands Dr. Eva Lindholm, chief curator of the Early Middle Ages department, a woman of sharp, analytical beauty and eyes that seem to always look several layers deeper than the superficiality of the world around her allows. She is extremely meticulous. Her clothes in shades of gray and navy blue blend perfectly with the sterile surroundings of the museum. But inside her, a passion burns as hot and untamed as the fire of the old forges that she has been researching for 20 years of her academic career. She stands still, with her hands clasped behind her back, but her posture betrays tension, a kind of combat readiness before the intellectual clash she has planned for this cold Tuesday morning. Her face is reflected in the glass of the display case, perfectly superimposed on the curved line of ancient iron, creating a poetic and amazing composition of a living, pulsating mind combined with a dead, unresolved relic of a bygone era. She knows this sword by heart, every scratch, every lump of preserved rust, every micron of its extraordinary curvature. She has seen it under an electron microscope, held it in her hands in the privacy of sterile laboratories, feeling its unnatural, even paradoxical balance. She knew that this piece of metal was a scientific heresy, a stain on the honor of modern materials science, something that made her question the textbooks she had helped write, and the feeling both terrified her and sent a euphoric, searching thrill through her. Today she was going to throw this challenge in the face of people who believed that humanity had reached the peak of technological development. She wanted to destroy their self-confidence with one silent piece of evidence from the past.
The silence of the exhibition hall, previously broken only by the almost inaudible hum of the air conditioning, was brutally shattered by the sound of heavy electronically locked doors opening and the steady, confident clatter of leather soles of expensive shoes on polished marble, signifying the arrival of the invited delegation. A group of 15 people entered, the cream of modern metallurgy and materials engineering, representatives of the largest international defense corporations, research institutes, and technical universities, from MIT to the Zurich University of Technology, men and women dressed in perfectly tailored, expensive suits, armed with tablets, smartphones, and unshakable belief in their own intellectual and technological supremacy. They entered the Viking zone with a hint of boredom and condescension. Their body language expressed skepticism. They whispered superiorly among themselves, treating the artifacts gathered around them not as engineering marvels, but as primitive, brutal tools of the Dark Age, mere historical curiosities with no relevance to their highly developed digital reality. Ava, watching them from the shadows, took note of their arrogance, the ironic half-smiles thrown at the simple iron axis, and felt a surge of sharp, almost predatory satisfaction at the thought of what she was about to do to them, how much it would shatter their comfortable, formulaic perceptions of history and technological progress. As they approached the central display case, Eva stepped forward from the shadows into the light and initiated the presentation in a calm, perfectly modulated voice that easily cut through their quiet, dismissive conversations and forced them to pay their absolute attention to her. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the heart of Danish history," she began, letting her words resonate throughout the high room. You have been brought here today not to admire primitive instruments of murder, as many of you probably assumed when looking at our magnificent inlaid swords in the neighboring display cases, but to face a riddle that has been keeping me and my team awake at night for 5 years, a riddle that, according to all the rules of your knowledge, has no right to exist in objective reality." She pointed with an elegantly gloved hand at the bent sword resting in the shaft of light. "Here is an object catalogued as K941, discovered 8 years ago deep in the layers of an anoxic peat bog in West Jutland, in an environment so perfectly isolated from oxygen and decomposition bacteria that the metal degradation processes were almost completely stopped. The item you are looking at has been subjected to rigorous radiocarbon dating of the organic remains of the vagina, as well as isotopic analysis of the iron ore itself, which clearly places the moment of its forging between the 800th and the 1000th AD. She fell silent for a split second, allowing the group of engineers to examine the curve of the blade. "And as you can see," she continued, a note of challenge in her voice, "this sword does not resemble the proud weapon of conquerors. It is bent into an almost perfect semicircle. Many of you probably think that this is damage that occurred centuries later, but I have gathered you here to make you aware that this curvature is the original state of deposition of the weapon, a state that reveals a metallurgical paradox that defies your most powerful computer simulations."
Getting to the heart of her lecture, Eva smoothly changed her tone from historian to tough materials analyst, hitting straight at the competences of her listeners. Before you start formulating obvious hypotheses, let's get down to hard, verified measurement data. Spectrometric analysis revealed that the cutting edges of this blade were forged from steel with a carbon content exceeding 0.9%, which, when properly hardened and tempered, gave a hardness of more than 58 on the Rockwell scale. Several metallurgists in the group flinched and exchanged surprised, skeptical glances when they heard the numbers corresponding to today's high-end switchblades. "That's right," Eva confirmed when she saw their reaction. "This hardness provides incredible edge retention, but, as all of you surely know all too well, it makes the material extremely brittle. Modern high-carbon steel, formed into a 90-centimeter-long sword and subjected to such a bending force as to achieve the geometry of this semicircle, would undergo catastrophic, rapid defragmentation, or simply put, it would shatter with enormous force like glass, scattering shards in all directions. For the sword to bend like that and not break, it would have to be composed of low-carbon, malleable steel, but that in turn would never maintain the sharp martensitic edge we still see here." She took a step closer to the display case. "And yet, this sword lies before you. Hard as tool steel, flexible as a reed. It has an impossible combination of extreme hardness and incredible longitudinal elasticity, a combination that today's computer-controlled steel industry cannot replicate without the use of modern, highly complex alloys and vacuum furnaces, and yet it was forged 1,000 years ago in a primitive forest forge."
The expected reaction came almost immediately as a tall, graying man in an impeccably tailored gray suit, chief engineer of a German steel company, pushed his way to the front of the group and interrupted the presentation with obvious irritation in his voice. "Doctor, with all due respect to your field, the laws of physics and the crystal structure of metals are absolute and unchangeable and are not subject to archaeological interpretation," he stated in a tone that brooked no objections. "What you describe is simply a fairy tale from the point of view of crystallography. This sword must have been subjected to a high-temperature tempering process, perhaps during a fire, bent into a plastic state and then thrown into a swamp, or was brutally deformed by the enormous pressure of masses of earth or construction machinery after corrosive processes within the structure weakened its integrity." Eva waited for this exact argument, her face remaining a mask of icy calm as she pulled a stack of printouts from her briefcase.
"Dr. Weber, I would be disappointed if you didn't suggest this," she replied, handing him thick, shiny sheets of paper. "These include scanning electron microscope scans, X-ray diffraction mapping, and full high-resolution ultrasonic flaw detection images. As you will notice when analyzing these data, on the outer edge of the curvature there are absolutely no, I repeat, no traces of microcracks in the crystal lattice structure that would have to have occurred during cold bending of the old material. The structure of martensite is continuous and flawless. Moreover, the peat patina layer is intact over the entire bending surface, which undoubtedly excludes any manipulation in modern times, including mechanical damage during extraction." The scientist stared at the printouts, the blood slowly draining from his face, as Eva dealt the final blow to his theory with surgical precision. "Additionally, there are no traces of secondary heating, and the grains of the paralytic structure have not undergone the growth typical of a fire. It was bent deliberately, right after forging, in ways we do not understand, demonstrating a material mastery that simply mocks our modern technology."
Eva's words acted as a vehicle, taking the narrative beyond the sterile walls of the museum and straight into the heart of modern testing laboratories, where the full failure of modern science was revealed in a series of dramatic flashbacks. The image in the listeners' minds and in the narrative of the story changed from the cool blue of the exposure to the harsh, blinding white fluorescent lights of research halls equipped with the most expensive diagnostic equipment on the planet. There, under the lenses of super-fast cameras recording millions of frames per second, massive hydraulic presses with a pressure of hundreds of tons were mercilessly lowered onto perfect laboratory-made replicas of Viking swords, forged from the purest modern high-carbon steel with an identical chemical composition to the original. Presses pressed against the steel, forcing it to curve. Machines howled with overload, and then, every time, without exception, there came a critical moment when the laws of modern physics brutally enforced their limits. It broke with a deafening, inhuman crack like a high-caliber gunshot, and in the slow motion of the cameras, you could watch the modern steel fail catastrophically, shattering into hundreds of razor-sharp pieces of shrapnel that struck and ricocheted with terrible force against the thick, bulletproof plexiglass shields, leaving deep, smoking indentations in them. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, countless hours of computer simulations, and the might of minds from top universities ended up in a pathetic pile of broken metal, proving conclusively that what had been done in a primitive forge in the 9th century was now absolutely, unquestionably impossible, and each subsequent exploding replica was a monument to the failure of arrogant modern engineering.
The narrative, after this explosive interlude in the minds of those gathered, abruptly returned to the cool, quiet space of the museum hall, where the attention of the entire group of experts, now clearly unnerved and intrigued beyond all measure, was focused solely on the surface of the impossible artifact. Eva, taking advantage of their newly awakened curiosity, turned on the display case's additional side lights with a special wavelength and ordered them to come closer until their breath began to fog the bulletproof glass separating them from the secret. Under the influence of a change in the lighting angle, the seemingly smooth and corroded surface of the sword came to life, revealing its deepest secrets in an amazing macro shot, revealing a breathtaking microscopic landscape to the researchers staring at it. From under the layer of dark, ancient patina, under the rust dulled by mud and centuries, emerged pale, ghostly patterns of the so-called carving, also known as forged Damascus steel, arranged in hypnotizing, complex swirls. These were not straight lines. These were microscopic rivers of metal, swirls, faults, and waves like a three-dimensional topographic map of some alien world, or the annual rings of an impossibly old petrified tree, where alternating hair-thin layers of light nickel and dark high-carbon steel intertwined in a way so fluid and perfect that it defied the use of any known early medieval hand tools.
Revealed under analytical light, this organic, pulsating texture was more than mere decoration. It was the coded language of lost metallurgy, a visual record of thousands of hammer blows, the infinite folding, welding, and stretching of matter to the brink of melting, a process so complex and requiring such spatial imagination that it defied the understanding of the creators of modern alloys gazing at it.
Gazing deeply into these intricate patterns, Eva allowed her mind to once again take the same fascinating journey, completely breaking away from the sterile blue coolness of the museum to immerse herself in a powerful, sensual vision of a bygone era, created in the convention of a raw, brutal chiaroscuro. In her imagination, the pristine LED lighting faded, replaced by the absolute thick and choking black of the unforgiving cold Scandinavian winter, a darkness so palpable that it seemed to consume every sound. The darkness was broken only by a single pulsating, angry point of light, the roaring, insatiable heart of the fireplace in the half-sunken forge, breathing aggressive, blinding orange-yellow heat that cast long, dancing, demon-like shadows on the rough-hewn stone walls. The atmosphere of the place was thick, almost suffocating, filled with stinging, sulphurous smoke, the smell of burnt charcoal, red-hot iron, and the sour stench of the sweat of a man who forged history in this hell, being more a priest of fire than a craftsman. Each strike of the powerful wooden hammer handle against the anvil sent fountains of blinding golden-white sparks into the air, illuminating his muscular figure for a split second, highlighting every drop of sweat and soot on his face before disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the original, deafening rhythm of colliding metal, the heartbeat of an ancient, harsh world based on blood and iron.
This sensual explosion in her mind was not just a poetic dream, it was a desperate analytical attempt to understand the elusive, almost alchemical process that must have been taking place there, a process that went beyond the dry chemical equations written in modern textbooks. Eva wondered obsessively what secret ingredients had been thrown into that crucible in the dark, whether it was bog ore rich in specific traces of manganese or vanadium, or perhaps the bones of defeated enemies or sacrificial animals that, as they burned, added priceless carbon and nitrogen to the melt in an act of primitive, intuitive carburizing and nitriding of the steel. She imagined this decisive moment, this hardening, this sudden drastic thermal shock during which the sword, heated to the color of the setting sun, was immersed, but in what? In water mixed with salt from a nearby fjord, in old animal oil, or some lost, forgotten technique of zone cooling using insulating clay, a technique so incredibly difficult and precise to perform by eye without digital pyrometers that it seemed like magic, a process so subtle that it could lock the crystal lattice, giving the desired shape memory effect without destroying the flexibility of the blade's core. This empirical knowledge, transmitted not in books but in blood, in muscle memory, and in a silent communication between the master and the living fire, disappeared in the darkness of history, becoming an irreversible loss for humanity, and the only trace of its existence was this bent piece of iron.
As the vision faded and Eva returned her gaze to the faces of the experts gathered around her, she noticed a drastic, fundamental change in the physical and emotional atmosphere filling the cold, sterile room. All previous arrogance disappeared. The contemptuous smiles and condescending glances cast from the perspective of the 21st century disappeared. Smartphones and tablets were lowered or put back into the pockets of elegant jackets, forgotten in the face of the power of the incomprehensible. The air, which a moment ago was full of whispers and murmurs of mockery, now became thick, heavy, and saturated with absolute, ear-piercing silence, a silence so profound and deep that it could almost be cut into pieces with the point of a drawn sword. In the eyes of the greatest minds in modern materials engineering, the people who every day designed tank armor and feet for space shuttles, Eva now saw only sincere, childlike confusion and heavy reverential awe. The process of their intellectual capitulation to the genius of the Viking Age was fascinating to watch. It was a collective realization of the painfully humbling truth that the technological development of humanity may not be a linear path ascending endlessly towards perfection, but a road strewn with forgotten peaks of knowledge that they, with all their supercomputers, still cannot reach.
For Eva, this incredible moment, this tangible density in the room, carried with it not only an academic triumph, but above all, an overwhelming burden of a deeply philosophical and existential nature, changing the way she looked at the objects blocked in the display cases. In her eyes, the bent sword had gone from being just a rare archaeological artifact to something infinitely more powerful, a monumental bridge spanning the abyss of an entire millennium, a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean of time by an anonymous 9th century master and into the hands and minds of the arrogant children of the Silicon Age. This unbroken curve of steel, bent against the laws of nature, seemed to scream in silence about the hubris of the present, being the final, irrefutable proof that true genius did not require electricity or sterile white coats to come into being, but only the unlimited human creativity, imagination, and determined will to subdue the elements of earth and fire. The sword mocking their ignorance, standing as the eternal, silent guardian of the secret that demanded to be rediscovered.
The end of the presentation took place in an atmosphere of quiet disbelief and deep self-reflection, as the shocked delegation of engineers, forced to rethink the foundations of their knowledge, slowly and with a clear newfound respect left the exhibition dedicated to the Vikings. Their retreating, hushed footsteps echoed off the marble floors, getting quieter by the second, until they finally fell silent behind the heavy glass doors, closing with a pneumatic hiss, leaving behind only unspoken questions hanging in the thick air. The museum hall returned to its original cool and sterile state. Blue and gray lights once again dominated the space, casting long geometric shadows on the gleaming floor, and the steady, calming hum of advanced air conditioning systems once again became the only sound in this mausoleum of time. Eva Lindholm was once again completely alone, isolated in the epicenter of history, separated from the hustle and bustle of the modern city by the thick walls of the museum, immersing herself back in the silence that was her natural environment, and the only place where she felt she could enter into a dialogue with the past. In the final, almost mystical silence of the empty museum, the light illuminating the central display case seemed to intensify as Eva took a slow, unconscious step forward, almost pressing her face against the cold, armored glass separating her world from that of the sword's creator. In the harsh, dramatic light of the chiaroscuro, perfectly layered with the intricate river-like carving patterns and rust-colored patina, her distinct reflection emerged. Determined, passionate, yet incredibly tired eyes stared from within the steel, her pursed lips forming a silent, determined line against the impossible bend. This poetic image, the fusion of a living human mind searching for answers with a dead, brilliant artifact created by hands that had been in the dust for 10 centuries, contained all the weight and meaning of the history to come. Her mind was struck with enormous force, louder than all arguments and equations, by one fundamental, short, obsessive word, whispered in empty space, which from that second was to become the axis and the only drive of her entire, further changed life. How?
Chapter 2. Obsesja w terenie.
We leave behind the sterile, controlled space of a modern laboratory and move to a completely different world, where history is not imprisoned in anti-reflective glass cases, but lives, breathes, and brews. It's a raw, open workshop located on the outskirts of Uppsala, in the heart of the Swedish province, where the cold wind from Lake Mälaren mixes with the thick, pungent smell of charcoal smoke and melted ore. At the center of this chaos controlled by fire and sweat stands Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose appearance is a complete contradiction of the stereotypical image of an outstanding scientist. Finch looks more like a blacksmith from centuries gone by than a university employee. His massive, muscular figure is hidden under a heavy leather apron, which bears traces of countless sparks and splinters of hot cinders. His face is smeared with soot, in which sweat has carved bright, shiny paths, and his calloused, blistered hands testify to years of hard physical work. Finch is an experimental archaeologist, a heretic in the world of theory, who rejects learning about history solely from old manuscripts and microscopic analyses in air-conditioned rooms. For him, the past is not a collection of dead facts, but a living process that can only be understood by reconstructing it from scratch with your own hands. Currently, his attention is focused on a monumental project. He is painstakingly rebuilding a Viking-age smokehouse, a structure of clay, sand, horse manure, and hewn stone that towers over the workshop like a primitive altar dedicated to the gods of fire and iron. The flames bursting from the upper opening of the furnace cast deep, dramatic shadows, creating a chiaroscuro-style scene where the black of the night mixes with furious shades of orange, rust, and yellow, highlighting every roughness of the clay walls and every muscle in the explorer's arms.
The rhythmic, powerful breathing of the huge leather bellows operated by Finch is the only sound disturbing the silence of the Swedish countryside, and each portion of air pushed in, fueling the embers inside the furnace, is another step in the brutal, primal dance with the elements, in which the bog ore slowly, reluctantly gives up its iron secrets. It is in this environment, full of the smell of sulfur, wet earth, and burnt wood, that Finch finds his scientific refuge, a place where academic knowledge must be tested against the hard physical laws of nature, and any mistake is punished with a burn or the irreversible loss of many days' work, which is the ultimate test of his theory about the craftsman genius of the old blacksmith masters. The sweat dripping down his neck and the smoke stinging his eyes are to him an integral part of the research process, as important as mass spectrometry is to scientists in sterile white coats with whom he dislikes identifying so much. This physical dimension of his work gives his research a tangible, brutal honesty that cannot be replicated in any computer simulation, and for him the roar of flames devouring charcoal is music that drowns out all doubts and connects him with an invisible thread to the nameless creators of the greatest blades of the Iron Age. This trance in which he finds himself is not only physical work, it is a deep, almost meditative bond with the material, a dialogue carried out using temperature, oxygen, and carbon, in which iron is not a dead lump, but a demanding partner, capricious and unpredictable, capable of destroying the entire work in a split second if it is not treated with proper respect and understanding of the laws that govern it.
Suddenly, brutally tearing apart the veil of this ancient trance, there is a sharp, synthetic, and painfully modern sound that sounds like blasphemy in this archaic environment. It's a notification beep from a laptop that rests on a makeshift desk made of an old oak barrel and a piece of board in a dark corner of the workshop, safely away from the sparks and embers. Finch stops pumping the bellows, letting the huge leather longs fall with a heavy sigh, his rhythm mercilessly interrupted. With obvious irritation, he wipes his dirty hands on a wax-impregnated rag, removing the thickest layer of pitch-black coal dust from them, and walks with slow, heavy steps towards the source of the sound. The bright, unnaturally cold blue-gray glow of the screen casts a glow on his wrinkled face that contrasts sharply with the warm, earthy tones of the burning smoke cigarette. It's an email from a colleague, a lab scientist with whom Finch has been engaged in friendly but sarcastic arguments for years about the superiority of practice over theory. The title of the message contains a short, intriguing phrase, "Copenhagen Bend, results you must see." Finch snorts under his breath, well aware of his colleague's tendency towards academic exaltation and exaggeration of minor anomalies in steel structures that, to an experienced blacksmith, are merely common errors of art. His skepticism is deeply rooted in years of practical experience, having seen hundreds of so-called miracle blades, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be merely neatly preserved examples of swords with mediocre properties, with a carburized layer hiding a core of brittle, slag-contaminated iron. As he expands on the email, his eyes quickly scan over the article's summary and the accompanying report, which describes a sword that exhibits physical properties impossible for the era in which it was supposedly made. He reads about the extraordinary flexibility, about the blade that after extreme bending returns to its original shape without the slightest micro-cracks in the crystal structure, and with every second his face contorts into an increasingly indulgent grimace. For Finch, the answer to this riddle is very simple. It must be either a purely ceremonial sword, forged from exceptionally soft ferritic iron that bends like lead, making it unsuitable for any real combat, or worse, some sublime 19th century forgery, skillfully placed in the historical context by some skillful fraudster who wanted to make a fortune on the wave of the Ven's romanticism and fascination with Viking culture. His academic distance kicks in automatically, like a defensive shield against yet another nonsense theory that tries to rewrite history based on misinterpreted data from machines that have never felt the heat of steel cooling in oil and do not understand the capricious nature of iron from bog ore. Finch is a man who trusts only in what he can forge, temper, and break in his own hands, and he treats reports of magical steel that defy the laws of Iron Age physics as seriously as reports of dragons and dwarven blacksmiths from the Norse sagas.
He is about to close the laptop and return to the physical, brutally honest work at the smokemaker, which demands his attention with a menacing hum and a slow drop in temperature, risking the loss of many hours of melting, when his eyes fall on one of the attachments marked spectrometric analysis and micrography. He stops mid-movement, and the quiet, nagging voice of research curiosity rings in his head, the same voice that once pushed him to leave the comfortable walls of the university and build his own workshop in frosty Sweden. Despite his defensive skepticism, he clicks on the attachment, and the screen loads a complex, multi-page metallurgical report filled with elemental distribution charts, X-ray diffraction mappings, and most importantly, detailed electron microscopy photographs showing the structure of the blade's deep steel layers. He leans heavily on the edge of the barrel as his eyes begin to analyze the hard, raw data, looking for obvious evidence that all this noise is just an equipment calibration error or an amateur interpretation of the spectrogram. However, what he sees does not fit any theory of fraud or measurement error known to him. The graphs show the almost complete absence of sulfur and phosphorus impurities, two of the greatest enemies of the historic blacksmith, which respectively cause hot and cold brittleness of steel, and whose elimination using the technology of that period was an absolute miracle and required a raw material of unprecedented chemical purity. Moreover, the distribution of carbon in the material structure, shown on spectrometric maps, is frighteningly even, devoid of the concentration gradients typical of strain evolution,
which suggests that the steel had to be brought to a completely liquid state, which was physically, thermodynamically, and technologically impossible in European hot melts from that period, which reached a maximum of 1200 to 1300 degrees Celsius.
Finch rubs his eyes, suspecting that the fatigue from long hours of work at the stove is impairing his ability to think logically, and then enlarges the first of the charts, checking the scale and research methodology, looking for any loophole in the iron logic of the presented results. He begins to analyze the content of trace elements, vanadium, molybdenum, trace amounts of cobalt, creating a chemical profile that resembles crucible steel from ancient Persia or India, the famous woots, but at the same time has isotopic signatures characteristic of ore from Scandinavia, which creates a paradox so deep that it destroys the very foundations of his previous knowledge. The precision of this data hits him with the force of a sledgehammer, shattering his initial assumptions. It is not a rookie error or a glitch in the analyzer's software. It is a raw, indisputable physical fact, recorded in the atomic structure of the artifact, that calls into question everything Finch and the entire scientific world knew about the technological abilities of the Viking Age. He forgets about the smoke maker, forgets about the slowly cooling slag and charcoal that needs to be added to the fire. His mind falls into the trap of cognitive dissonance, and the world around him narrows only to the glowing blue rectangle of the screen. The sun slowly disappears below the horizon, and a thick, cold darkness descends on the Swedish province, swallowing the silhouettes of the pine trees and turning the workshop into an island of light in the ocean of night. A long, exhausting research marathon begins, a nighttime assembly of work, during which the workshop turns into a chaotic, improvised library illuminated by the rusty glow of cooling coals and the cold light of the laptop matrix.
Finch, forgetting about hunger and physical exhaustion, takes out from heavy wooden boxes piles of dust-covered notes, photocopies of old manuscripts from Al-Andalus, rare publications on the technology of smelting Damascus steel, and reports on the most famous finds of Ulfbert's swords. Surrounded by this waste paper chaos, he analyzes line by line, graph by graph, trying to find any precedent, any clue that would allow him to rationally explain the Copenhagen bend phenomenon on the basis of the history of metallurgy known to science. The air in the workshop becomes sharp and cold. The smell of heated clay gives way to the metallic, crisp smell of a frosty night, but the researcher does not seem to notice it, completely absorbed in comparing the cooling curves, martensitic phases, and perlite structure with the data displayed on the machine screen. Each rejected hypothesis increases his frustration, but at the same time fuels the fire of curiosity, forcing him to dig deeper and deeper into more exotic and less researched theories about early trade routes, technology transfer from the Middle East, and secret guild techniques that may have been lost to the mists of time. With each sentence he reads and each graph he examines, Finch realizes that this is not just another interesting museum curio, but an artifact that has the potential to cause an earthquake in the hermetic world of archaeometallurgy. His initial nonchalance and cynicism disappear forever, and his body posture changes from relaxed and confident to tense, leaning over the desk like a predator preparing to pounce on its prey. Somewhere in the middle of the night, when the darkness reaches its deepest point and the silence is so absolute that he can hear his own heartbeat, he opens a series of electron microscope photos that reveal 100-fold magnification of the sword's core. Slowly, with reverent caution, he zooms in on the crystalline structure, and the sight that unfolds before his eyes makes him hold his breath in a sudden attack of cognitive shock. The screen shows an extremely complex network, a contradiction of everything he knew about traditional packet welding. There are no alternating thick layers of soft and hard iron connected by seams saturated with slag. Instead, Finch sees an almost organic fractal structure,
unimaginably tiny, perfectly spherical particles of hard cementite suspended in a flexible ferrite-pearlite matrix with a precision reminiscent of modern carbon nanotubes produced in nanotechnology laboratories rather than the work of a blacksmith standing at a coal fire 1,000 years ago. The smooth black screen is reflected in his dilated pupils, creating a hypnotic image in macro close-up. His eyes literally reflect the microscopic forgotten code of carbon and iron, written in the matrix of ancient weapons. The expression on his face is a mixture of absolute disbelief, intellectual horror, and sudden, overwhelming admiration for the artistry of the creator, who must have had knowledge so profound that it almost bordered on alchemy. Finch now fully understands, with complete shocking clarity, that such a distribution of iron carbide grains could not have arisen by chance as a result of primitive forging and hardening, but had to be a strictly controlled process with precise temperature management down to just a few degrees in an environment where the only thermometer was the trained eye of a blacksmith assessing the color of the glowing metal.
In that split second, academic detachment and cool analysis finally shatter like brittle glass under the blow of a heavy hammer, giving way to something much more powerful. It is no longer a cold research interest. It is a personal, almost intimate challenge thrown at him over the space of 1,000 years by a brilliant craftsman who has mastered the secret of manipulating matter at the molecular level. Skepticism turns into a burning, mind-consuming obsession, a feeling so intense it's almost painful, which forces him to jump up and nervously begin to traverse the uneven, hard-packed earth of his workshop. Dozens of variables swirl in his head: thermal cycles, cooling rates, mysterious alloy additions from local herbs or powdered animal bones rich in carbon and calcium, the kinetics of phase transformations from austenite to martensite, and each step on the ground increases the rhythm of his galloping thoughts. He realizes that this is not just an anomaly to be cataloged, described in a boring article in a scientific journal and forgotten. It is a forgotten, dormant language of metal, a manifesto of ancient materials engineering waiting for its translator. He stops in front of the cold anvil, touches its smooth, chilled surface with his calloused hand, and feels a mystical, almost physical bond with this nameless master from the past. This sense of unity with someone who shared the same passion, the same smell of burning coal, and the same desire to create the perfect blade is an overwhelming feeling. It is no longer just a study of history. It becomes a matter of rescuing a fragment of the highest, lost human genius from eternal oblivion.
Standing there in the semi-darkness, he experiences a profound epiphany, a sudden revelation that changes the direction of his professional life forever. He realizes with absolute certainty that no single most powerful analytical machine, no supercomputer generating thermodynamic models, and no simulation in a sterile laboratory will ever solve this puzzle in a satisfactory manner. Mainstream science can show exactly what this sword is made of and what its internal structure looks like at the nanometer level, but it is completely blind and deaf to the key question: how this was achieved using primitive tools. The tacit knowledge of the old craftsman, the so-called tacit knowledge, recorded in muscle memory, in the angle of the hammer blow, in the way of listening to the hiss of steel hardened in linseed oil, in the nuances of the color of the flame, is impossible to quantify and translate into the language of mathematical formulas. The only way to understand this phenomenal artifact, the only true way to decode this ancient message, is to bleed for it, sweat for it, burn your hands, and reconstruct it from the absolute scratch with sweat and iron. The real answer lies not in the pixels on the screen, but in the sparks falling from the anvil. Uncovering this secret will require hundreds of failed attempts, destroyed blades, and an unimaginable amount of physical strength. Finch decides that he will abandon all his current safe and stable research projects. His entire life will now be subordinated to one overarching and bordering on madness goal: to recreate the structure of the Copenhagen bend sword with his own hands. Night passes unnoticed into morning, and the first timid rays of the pale sun begin to lazily pierce through the thick fog hanging over the fields of Uppsala, painting the sky in cool, melancholy shades of steel, gray, and faded cold blue. Finch stands motionless in front of his massive furnace, which has finally gone out during his long hours of nocturnal contemplation, its once red-hot clay walls now cold to the touch and covered with a thin layer of frost brought on by the morning frost. The contrast between the overwhelming coldness of the surroundings and the roaring, internal fire of newborn obsession in Finch's mind is so powerful that it's almost palpable. His silhouette, framed by the harsh glow of the rising sun and the remnants of the fog, now exudes a new, powerful type of focus. The exhaustion of sleepless nights and hard work has completely evaporated, replaced by an iron, absolute and unyielding determination that stiffens his spine and lifts his chin proudly. He rests his huge hand on the handle of a heavy blacksmith's hammer resting on an anvil, and this simple primitive gesture is an almost sacred seal of a silent pact made with the ghosts of the past, a declaration of war declared on oblivion. He knows perfectly well that the path he is entering will be full of pain, frustration, and dead ends, that the coming months and maybe even years will be filled with the taste of ash in his mouth and endless analyses of thousands of alloy variants. However, in his heart there is no longer any trace of hesitation or academic coldness. There is only the pure, primal passion of a researcher who has found the holy grail of his discipline and knows that he will not rest until he pulls a blade with a perfect carbon structure from his own furnace. The great mission of his life has just begun, and with the first blow of the hammer on the anvil, which will soon shatter the silence of the morning, the boundary between the ancient magic of blacksmithing and modern science will cease to exist forever.
Chapter 3. The Shattering Lesson.
We go back in time exactly 1,000 years to a harsh, wind-swept fjord in the heart of Norway, where nature still dictates the conditions of human existence. The air here is filled with the smell of sea salt, rotting seaweed, and the sharp, resinous aroma of old pines that miraculously cling to the rocky slopes. Against the background of this frosty, gray-blue landscape, tucked into the mountainside, a forge smokes, the heart of craftsmanship, pulsating with fire and iron. From the outside it looks like an inconspicuous, half-sunken hut covered with turf, from which thick black smoke rises, which is the only evidence of life in this wasteland. However, after crossing the heavy oak door, the cool, sterile light of the Scandinavian morning gives way to an aggressive, deep chiaroscuro, reminiscent of Caravaggio's darkest paintings. Inside, the heat is hellish, and the only source of light is a furiously roaring fireplace, which casts dramatic orange-red reflections on the sweat-damp, raw-cut stone walls. This forge is a sanctuary of the elements, a place where man tries to impose his will on primeval matter. In this stuffy air, saturated with coal dust and the smell of sulphur, a young, extremely ambitious journeyman named Bjorn faces his most important test. His silhouette, illuminated from below by the glow of a glowing coal, seems powerful and menacing, and his every move betrays the boundless youthful energy that bubbles under his taut skin. Bjorn believes that today he will finally prove his worth, that today he will forge a blade that will surpass anything ever created in this valley, not realizing that pride is the worst adviser against the merciless laws of metallurgy.
The young blacksmith leans over a massive anvil, and his powerful, burn-scarred arms lift the heavy iron hammer with terrifying aggression. Bjorn is the embodiment of brute force. He believes that blacksmithing is, above all, a fight, a physical clash with matter that must be dominated, crushed, and forced into obedience. The blows of the hammer fall on the red-hot billet of iron with a deafening roar, reminiscent of the ringing of bells during the apocalypse. Each strike releases a fountain of blinding golden sparks that, like a swirl of fiery insects, splash in all directions, illuminating for a split second the deep shadows that lie in the corners of the forge. A close-up from a macro perspective would at this point reveal microscopic flakes of scale that detach from the surface of the formed blade with a quiet crack, revealing the raw, still unformed soul of the metal. Bjorn works at a frantic pace, his breathing heavy and raspy, and beads of salty sweat roll down his hardened face, mixing with the coal dust and forming dirty, dark streaks on his cheeks. The hammer's leather handle creaks under the pressure of his iron grip, as the boy, driven by a desperate desire to impress his master, pours all of his frustration, ambition, and unwavering self-righteousness into each swing. There is no finesse in his movements. There is no listening to the song of steel. There is only blunt physical domination, the rhythm of war beaten on the anvil, which is intended to force iron to become an instrument of murder. Bjorn's obsession with the hardness of the blade borders on fanaticism, which is evident in the way he treats the heated material. In his youthful, inexperienced mind, the ideal sword is one that will not bend to anything, whose edge is as hard as a diamond and sharp as a razor. To achieve this, he pushes his billet deep into the heart of the fireplace, having his fellow journeyman pump the bellows with maximum force, until the fire turns a blinding, almost white yellow. The temperature rises to the point where the steel begins to absorb carbon from the environment around it in an uncontrolled and greedy manner. Bjorn watches this process with fascination, seeing how the steel becomes richer in carbon.
When the smoke finally clears and the hard work of the anvil is over, it's time for the final touches and finishing that will finally cement Bjorn's position in the forge. With great care, using rough grinding stones with increasingly finer grain, the young apprentice removes the black, rough layer of scale from the sword's surface, revealing the bright, almost mirror-like shine of the steel. The camera could then slowly move along the blade, capturing every tiny detail. The raw texture of the grindstone rubbing against the cold metal, the microscopic scratches left by the sand, and the fascinating, subtle pattern of carbon steel structure that begins to loom beneath the surface. When Bjorn finally holds the finished sword up to the firelight, its surface glows with a cold, deadly glow, reflecting the dancing flames within. The boy's face, tired but triumphant, slowly fades into an expression of absolute self-confidence, which quickly turns into arrogance. His lips curl into a cynical, self-confident smile, and in his eyes there is only a vision of the coming glory, applause and recognition from the master. Bjorn believes he has forged a masterpiece, a blade so hard and sharp that it could cut through the wind itself, completely ignoring the fact that hardness without flexibility is only a promise of disaster. With his sword resting proudly in his hands, Bjorn turns to present his work to the master, and the bustle of the forge immediately fades away, as if cut off by a knife. Master Eric is an almost legendary figure, an elderly, silent man, with skin resembling old, cracked oak bark, and hands marked with thousands of scars, burns, and calluses, silent witnesses of a whole life spent in the embrace of fire. Eric sits in deep shadow, away from the brightest flames of the hearth, his face completely impenetrable, betraying absolutely no emotion. When Bjorn holds out his shining blade with an exaggerated, arrogant gesture, expecting admiration and praise, Eric doesn't even blink, his sharp, piercing eyes examining the sword with cold, analytical precision.
The air in the forge suddenly becomes thick and heavy, filled with an unbearable tension that could be cut with a knife, while the other, younger apprentices freeze, holding their breath and watching the scene from behind the pillars and piles of coal. The silence stretches, becoming an almost physical weight pressing down on Bjorn's shoulders, whose confident smirk begins to tremble slightly under the old blacksmith's withering gaze, though his pride still prevents him from seeing his impending defeat. Finally, without a word, Eric nods towards the other end of the forge, where a massive oak pole protrudes from the packed earth, badly scarred, deeply chipped, and marked by the blows of thousands of previous attempts. The time has come for the final test, the rite of passage that separates true craftsmanship from worthless illusions. Bjorn, trying to hide his growing anxiety behind a bravado mask, strides towards the stake with a proud, springy step, his figure cutting through shafts of light and deep shadows, creating a strikingly cinematic, dark image. With each step, his hand grips the raw wood handle tighter, the grain of which digs into his sweaty skin, reminding him of the raw physicality of this moment. The boy stands in front of an oak trunk, takes a deep, wheezing breath that fills his broad chest with air filled with the smell of rust, dust, and sweat. An image of a sword slicing through thick wood like warm butter is painted in his mind, an image of a final triumph that will forever place his name in the pantheon of the greatest fjordsmiths, a delicious vision that completely blinds his senses, preventing him from seeing the fragile, glassy nature of his overcarbonated creation. The moment of impact itself seems to unfold in an excruciating, surreal slow motion where every millisecond is.
In a split second, the kinetic energy trapped inside the overcarbonized elastic steel has nowhere to escape, so it tears the metal structure from the inside, causing a spectacular explosion. Bjorn's sword, his pride, shatters with a loud crack and literally shatters into dozens of razor-sharp pieces that shoot out in all directions like deadly shards of glass. In slow motion, the camera follows the trajectory of these gleaming fragments as they swirl through the air, reflecting the orange glow of the fire and the cool gray light streaming through the cracks in the roof. Each shard a dashed hope, a split second of glory reduced to useless scrap. The powerful high-frequency vibration born from the moment of breakage travels through the hilt to Bjorn's arm with the force of an electric shock, paralyzing his muscles and shaking him to the marrow. Shards of iron land with a clatter on the forge's floor, jumping and spinning on the hard-packed earth until they finally come to a dead stillness in the shocked apprentice's hand. All that remains is the denuded, pathetic stump of the handle, a sharp caricature of the weapon he had just moments ago considered the most perfect in the world. There's a moment of absolute crushing, ear-ringing silence in which time seems to stop completely and dust slowly settles on the lifeless pieces of metal. This silence is heavier than the thickest anvil, thicker than the smoke of a hearth, and within it Bjorn's pride is crumbling to atoms faster than his sword. Suddenly, from the deep, tarry shadows of the forge, there come faint, muffled snorts that quickly turn into malicious whispers and open taunts from other journeymen who see their arrogant colleague fall. Each laugh hits Bjorn like a whip, and he stands frozen, his wide eyes staring in disbelief at the void where his creation was a second ago. His face, until recently contorted into a proud smile, turns hot, scarlet, of absolute humiliating shame, and his hands begin to tremble in uncontrollable spasms, and in an instant the powerful, self-confident warrior craftsman is reduced to a terrified lost boy whose world has just collapsed. Master Eric finally emerges from the shadows with slow, steady, and inexorable steps, and his presence immediately silences the chuckles of the apprentices, restoring the grave silence to the forge. The sound of his heavy leather boots crushing the coal dust on the floor is like a verdict as he approaches the crash site.
The contrast between the panic on Bjorn's face and the absolute blood-curdling calm of the master is striking. Erik does not radiate anger or disappointment. His aura is rather the eternal, cool wisdom of nature, which does not judge the storm for breaking trees, but only states the fact. He slowly bends over the ground, and the glow of the hearth illuminates his deep wrinkles, highlighting every detail of his ascetic face. The old craftsman reaches out with his massive, mutilated hand, and with utmost care lifts one of the largest still shining shards of the broken sword from the dust. The narrator's insightful eye, like a modern microscope in the sterile bluish light of the laboratory, focuses on the dramatic grain structure of the steel, where instead of fine, smoothly woven together fibers, you can see huge, thick, and brittle carbon crystals trapped in a dead matrix of iron. The surface of the crack sparkles in the orange firelight like a rough, impure diamond, revealing the merciless truth of the sword's architecture. It was as hard as glass and just as brittle. Erik's finger, calloused and black with soot, slowly traces the sharp, jagged edge of the fragment, feeling every microscopic irregularity, every evidence of brutal haste and bravado.
When Erik finally breaks the silence, his voice is deep, low, and incredibly rough, like the sound of two river stones rubbing against each other, each word carrying the weight of centuries of experience and countless failures. "You tried to command the iron," says the master, never taking his eyes off the ruined steel, his tone devoid of accusation, conveying only the sad, indisputable truth about the nature of the universe. "You forced him, beat him, and suffocated him in icy water, believing that your will was stronger than his being. You have to learn to ask them. A sword is not one hard thing. It is many different things, many natures living together in harmony. The hardness of the edge, the softness of the core, the flexibility of the back." These dark, enigmatic words, thrown into the dusty air of the forge, slowly reach Bjorn's consciousness, crushing his previous primitive understanding of the world. The master's words fall on Bjorn's mind like heavy blacksmith's hammers, shattering the remnants of his defensive illusions and plunging him into an ocean of bottomless despair. It begins to dawn on him with painful, burning clarity that all his physical strength, aggression, and speed will be of no use, that what he thought were advantages had led him to spectacular defeat. He looks at the pathetic stump in his hand and the silvery shards scattered around, and the image becomes a metaphor for his own shattered ego, which was built on the false foundations of arrogant ignorance. Tears of frustration and shame mix with the sweat on his face as he finally realizes that the path to mastery is not about conquest, but about a deep, humble understanding and cooperation with the elements. From the perspective of modern cold material science, which the narrator could apply to this ancient scene, Bjorn's error is a textbook example of ignoring solid-state physics. The boy saturated the steel with carbon to such an extent that a hypertectoid alloy was created, and then, by too rapid and aggressive cooling in brine, forced the transformation of austenite into martensite with extreme internal stresses without any subsequent tempering. He completely omitted the art of layer welting and did not include a soft, low-carbon core that would absorb the impact energy, creating a monolith that was harder than a file but devoid of any ductility. Invisible to the naked eye, this crystalline tragedy, full of microscopic fractures at grain boundaries, is the hidden layer of this lesson, proving that the laws of physics are inexorable and unchanged for millennia, and will punish anyone who tries to ignore them in the name of their own hubris. As the scene slowly draws to a close, the fire in the massive hearth begins to die down, reducing its furious yellow flames to the calm, deep ruby heat of pulsing coals.
The other apprentices, instructed in silence by this shocking spectacle, slowly return to their posts, and the rhythmic, careful clatter of hammers echoes through the forge again, now much quieter and more respectful. Bjorn is left alone in the middle of the dirt floor, surrounded by the cooling shards of his defeat, slowly rusting in the humid air, with the inherent smell of brimstone and personal failure inhaling with every breath. He picks up a worn-out birch broom and, with an unnatural, heavy slowness, begins to sweep away the sharp steel debris, knowing deep in his broken soul that this devastating lesson, full of pain and humility, is, in fact, only the first true step on the infinitely long path to becoming a master.
Chapter 4. The Blood of the Bog.
Dawn over the swamps did not come with a sudden brightness, but rather as a slow, almost reluctant retreat of deep darkness before a pressing, thick fog that seemed to have a life of its own. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something sharp, metallic, that scratched at the throat with each inhalation. Eric led Bjorn away from the safe, familiar warmth of the forge into a landscape that seemed alien and hostile to the young apprentice. Bjorn followed a few steps behind the master, his mind still consumed with frustration and a sense of failure from yesterday's failed attempts at the anvil. Each step through the muddy, crumbling moss reminded him of his own incompetence, and the cold, bone-deep dampness increased his impatience. He expected that the next day would bring him a chance for redemption in the forge, that he would be able to hammer with the hammer until he finally understood steel. But instead, they found themselves in a wasteland where there was neither fire nor anvil. The view was truly cinematic, full of raw, untamed nature, where earthy tones of charcoal, rust, and deep browns mixed with the omnipresent cool gray of the morning. The trees around them, twisted and leafless, stood like silent witnesses to their journey, their roots digging into the soft ground like gnarled fingers. Eric moved with incredible grace, as if he were part of the place, his heavy leather boots silently finding firm footing, while Bjorn stumbled, sank ankle-deep in mud, and cursed under his breath. This journey was not an escape from the craft, but its absolute beginning, a return to the very source from which all great weapon makers drew, though Bjorn in his youthful arrogance did not yet see it, seeing only endless cold and forbidding swamps that seemed to swallow every sound and every ray of sunlight. As they moved deeper into the heart of the swamp, the ground beneath them became more and more treacherous, and the pools of black, stagnant water turned into vast, shallow pools, the surface of which shimmered with strange, rusty colors. The water was icy, and its touch penetrated thick layers of wool and leather, making Bjorn's muscles contract involuntarily as he was forced to wade almost knee-deep in it. Eric stopped where the water seemed darkest, with oily, rust-colored stains floating on its surface like dried blood. "Look carefully, boy," the master said, his voice sounding hollow in the fog that surrounded them. "Many fools think that the best iron lies deep in the bowels of the mountains, waiting for someone to pluck it out with a pickaxe. But the mountains are dead. True iron, the one that has a soul, is born here, in water and mud." Bjorn looked at the cloudy liquid with obvious skepticism, unable to hide the discouragement from his young, tense face. How could a sword worthy of a king be forged from this stinking, rotting pool? Eric, ignoring the student's doubts, began to explain that the earth breathes, that water washes away its essence, and that the roots of plants and the invisible forces of nature collect this essence in the form of ore, which is like the blood of the wetlands themselves. It was a deeply spiritual approach, contrasting with the cold, analytical precision with which modern scientists in sterile, bluish-lit laboratories would explain the process of precipitation of iron hydroxides by bacteria in an oxygen-free environment.
To Eric, this place was a living organism, and the bog ore was not simply a chemical compound, but a carrier of the Earth's memory, a material that absorbed patience, time, and strength of survival, qualities that would ultimately have to be passed on to the blade in order for it to endure the hardships of the battles to come. Understanding this process required the rejection of superficial judgments and immersion, literally and figuratively, in the primal, dirty, and unpredictable womb of nature.
The smelting process itself, the reduction of bog ore into metallic iron, was slow, tedious, and required constant, almost meditative attention for many long hours. The master and apprentice took turns loading equal portions of black charcoal and roasted, crushed ore into the furnace from the top, ensuring that the ratio of fuel to raw material was perfectly balanced. Bjorn, operating the bellows, felt his arms burn with the effort and sweat trickle down his back and chest despite the icy cold of the night around them. An almost magical chemical alchemy was taking place deep inside the clay shaft as carbon monoxide rising from the burning wood bonded with oxygen molecules trapped in the red rock, breaking them loose and releasing the contaminants in the form of liquid, foamy slag, leaving behind a spongy mass of pure metal. Although Eric did not know concepts such as chemical reduction, oxides, or the melting point of slag, which would be studied centuries later in fluorescent-lit classrooms, his understanding of the process was absolute and flawless, based on observations of the color of the flame, the sound of the furnace, and the smell of the smoke. For him, it was talking to the iron spirits, convincing them to leave their earthly shell and merge into something new, something more powerful. However, with each subsequent movement of the bellows, the student struggled with his weaknesses, muscle pain and drowsiness, and his initial curiosity and enthusiasm quickly gave way to a dull, exhausting routine, fueling an internal rebellion against this archaic, time-consuming method of obtaining material that they could have used from ready-made supplies. Finally, as the eastern sky began to glow with the first rays of a new day, Eric ordered the bellows to stop and announced that the process was over. Using heavy steel poles and long tongs, they began to demolish the lower part of the clay oven to extract the fruit of their back-breaking work. As they hit the wall, the clay cracked open with a dry crack, and a blinding orange-white light erupted from within the smokehouse, coupled with a shock wave of murderous heat that made Bjorn reflexively take a few steps back. The sight was stunning. Amid the ruins, molten slag like thick black lava and unburned coal lay the shale, a glowing, spongy mass of pure metal, shining like a miniature sun trapped on the ground. Pulling it out of the white-hot core of the furnace required precision and strength because the lump was heavy, irregular, and covered with sticky, melting impurities. As Eric pulled the slate out, gripping it with his massive pincers, thousands of bright sparks flew into the air, illuminating their tired faces in the darkness of the receding night. The mass did not resemble hard, smooth steel in any way. It was a rough, twisted mass full of empty spaces in which trapped slag boiled, making quiet, hissing sounds. It was the moment of birth. The dirty, mud-mixed ore from the swamps, through fire and human work, was transformed into a new, untamed form of matter that emanated not only heat, but also the promise of the potential hidden within it, ready to be unleashed on the anvil. The sight made Bjorn realize why the master called the blacksmith's craft a calling. To stand at the confluence of the forces of nature and the will of man, shaping useless stone into the stuff from which empires rise and kings fall, was a feeling bordering on divine agency. Despite his exhaustion, he stared fascinated for a moment at this pulsating heat proof of their common victory over the indomitable nature, although he knew that this was only the beginning of the road and the real challenge was yet to come.
However, there was no time for long admiration or admission of the beauty of the glowing metal, because the slate, pulled out of the protective environment of the furnace, was rapidly losing temperature, and the slag contained in it was in danger of solidifying.
Chapter 5. The Serpent's Twist. Returning to the forge after the initial preparations felt like descending into the bowels of the underworld itself, where the air was thick with coal dust, and each breath was like inhaling bits of history and the raw, untamed energy of craftsmanship. Eric, whose face resembled a sculpture carved from granite rock, stood in the very center of this dark chiaroscuro sanctuary, lit only by the uneven, flickering flames of the fireplace. This light, with deep, earthy shades of amber, rust, and fiery orange, brought out from the darkness every detail of his time-worn hands, each scar telling the story of thousands of hours spent with hammer and anvil. On a massive, scratched and time-marked anvil, the surface of which shone with a cold steel glow, the master placed precisely prepared rods drawn from two drastically different iron slates which constitute the foundation of all their current work. On one side lay high-carbon steel, hard, brittle, and dark as a starless night, with the promise of deadly sharpness, and on the other low-carbon iron, soft, malleable, with a lighter, almost silvery color that would give the blade flexibility and shock resistance. Eric, looking into his student's eyes with an almost priestly seriousness, began to explain that the real art was not in creating one perfect block of homogeneous material, which would be the path of modern mass production, but in forcing these two contradictory natures to work together, in weaving them into a uniform, inseparable pattern. It was in this process the ancients called biting, where hardness met elasticity to create an alloy with properties far greater than the sum of its parts. And as Bjorn listened to these words, he felt his modern analytical approach to metallurgy begin to give way to a deep, almost mystical respect for the intuition of ancient craftsmen who, without electron microscopes, could manipulate the crystal structure of steel at the atomic level. The difference between the materials was not just a matter of chemical composition, but primarily of haptic properties, which Bjorn realized the moment he slipped off the heavy leather gloves and carefully ran his bare, not yet fully calloused fingertips over the cold, rough surface of the metal. He felt every speck of oxidized scale, every microscopic irregularity that had occurred during the initial forging of the shale into raw bars, and this physical closeness to the matter made images of the structure of carbon seeping into the iron matrix come to life in his imagination. In a sterile, cold laboratory in Oslo, flooded with the merciless light of fluorescent light, iron was just a set of data, rows of numbers on a monitor screen, an X-ray diffraction diagram, and a series of high-resolution microscope photos showing perlite and martensite grains in a safe, isolated environment. But here, in the heart of a traditional Viking forge, where the rough stone walls absorbed the heat and the smell of sulfur and charred wood stung the nostrils, that same metal seemed a living, capricious thing, a beast dormant in the coal dust that needed not so much processing as awakening and taming through the brutal yet precise power of fire and steel. Eric explained in a slow, deep voice that pure steel, while capable of maintaining razor sharpness, would shatter like glass upon first contact with an opponent's shield, while pure iron, although capable of withstanding powerful blows without breaking, would bend and become dull faster than the warrior could strike a second blow. That is why their task was to create a marriage of these extremes, to unite opposites into one, which required not only knowledge and strength, but above all, absolute devotion to the process in which every layer, every weave, and...
Chapter 6. The Weight of the Challenge. Before we can fully understand the unimaginable, crushing weight of the challenge that hung in the thick, smoke-filled air that day, we must leave for a moment the brutal, deafening reality of the 10th century and transport ourselves to the sterile, soundless sanctuary of a modern metallurgical laboratory. In this cool room, lit by the merciless bluish and gray light of fluorescent lamps, under the powerful lens of a scanning electron microscope, lies an inconspicuous, rusting fragment of an ancient blade, which is the only silent witness of those dramatic events. The digital screen reveals a mesmerizing, almost alien landscape of microstructures, a breathtaking, intricate mosaic of light ferrite and dark, banded pearlite, intertwined in a microscopic, unbreakable embrace that has survived a millennium spent in the moist, destructive earth. This fascinating crystalline lattice, this perfect marriage of softness and hardness, was not created by the operation of precise, computer-controlled vacuum furnaces, but was born in absolute chaos, in the heart of a roaring flame, under the blows of human hands, in a place where science was only whispered intuition, and technology was based on sweat, blood, and primitive muscle power. The contrast between this analytical, cold precision of modern science, analyzing every atom of carbon subjected to diffusion, and the raw, elemental power of the early medieval forge is absolutely striking and is the key to understanding the art that young Bjorn was trying to master. As our perspective shifts back in time, the sterile blues of the laboratory rapidly give way to blinding, aggressive oranges, blood reds, and deep, pitch-black blacks. We find ourselves back in Eric's forge, where the air temperature is so high that each breath is like inhaling hot sand into one's lungs, and the only rhythm that marks the passage of time is the deafening metallic sound of a hammer striking an anvil. Bjorn, exhausted to the limits of human endurance, stands in the very center of this hell, unaware of the existence of pearlite or ferrite, focused solely on the murderous, repetitive process that will magically transform the brittle lump of iron from the smelter into flexible, deadly steel. With each powerful blow, sending a painful, vibrating shockwave up his forearms, through his elbows, and into the tense muscles of his neck, the boy continues his slow, monotonous dance with the hot metal. The light emanating from the fireplace, intensified by the rhythmic groans of a large bellows, reminiscent of the heavy breathing of a dying monster, casts deep dramatic shadows on the brutally hewn stone walls of the forge, reminiscent of master paintings in the chiaroscuro style. Sweat trickles down his face in dirty gray streams, carving winding paths through the thick layer of coal dust and rusty scale that coats his skin like war paint. The wooden handle of the hammer, worn loose by years of constant friction and saturated with the natural oils of human skin, almost grows into his bleeding, calloused hands. Bjorn methodically, almost reverently, assembles the yellow-hot billet of steel, coating it with a layer of protective flux that hisses and spits on contact with the oxygen before striking it again, fusing the layers together. It is a slow, frustrating process of eliminating microscopic impurities and slag, requiring superhuman patience, where one false move, one hit at the wrong angle or at too low a temperature can lead to irreversible cracking of the structure and the destruction of many days of titanic, murderous work. It is at this moment, when Bjorn is in a state of deep, almost trance-like concentration, that the intimate, isolated space of the forge is brutally violated. A massive, powerful figure stands in the wide, dark doorway, completely blocking the already sparse, pale world.
Chapter 7. The Woven Soul.
The morning in the forge greeted them with heavy, thick air in which the metallic smell of yesterday's work still lingered, mixing with the acrid aroma of burnt charcoal and raw earth. Bjorn stood in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness, illuminated only by the pale rays of sunlight that pierced like spears of light through the cracks in the wooden roof, dancing in the swirling particles of dust and ash. The contrast between this raw, spontaneous place and the sterile space of the modern laboratory, saturated with cool, bluish fluorescent light, where he spent his last years, struck him with an unprecedented force.
In the laboratory, surrounded by electron microscopes, mass spectrometers, and screens displaying perfectly ordered crystallographic plots, steel was to him a set of data, a mathematical abstraction, a predictable arrangement of iron and carbon atoms that could be described by complex thermodynamic equations. Here, in the bowels of the old forge, surrounded by rough stones, oak trunks, and omnipresent soot, steel regained its original, almost brutal physicality. She became a capricious, dangerous being, requiring not only knowledge, but above all respect and intuition. The challenge he faced, recreating the legendary sword while maintaining authentic Viking techniques, was no longer just a fascinating scientific experiment, but became a personal test of character, a physical and mental passage through fire. The weight of this task settled on his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He felt every hammer blow from the previous days in his muscles, every microscopic contraction of the hand tightening on the shaft, and yet he knew that it was all just a prelude, a warm-up for what was to come today. Today, they were going to create the heart of the blade. Eric, the master, whose face resembled a landscape carved by wind, time, and the heat of the hearth, was already standing at the anvil, silently staring at the still extinguished hearth. He didn't have to say anything. The vibration of expectation and deep concentration filled the space between them with dense, almost tangible matter. Bjorn took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of rust and sulfur, the scent of history, waiting to be forged again, and moved towards the anvil, ready for the final confrontation with matter. On the massive anvil block, covered with scars from thousands of blows, lay the fruit of their murderous work so far, 6 slender, twisted rods that from a distance could be passed for the charred branches of some strange metal tree. Bjorn leaned over them, his nose almost touching their cool, rough surface, his eyes focusing on the microscopic details, on the textures that told the story of the powerful forces to which they were subjected. Each of these bars was in fact a complex multi-layer composite made of alternately welded and forged layers of soft, malleable furnace iron and harder, more carbon-rich steel, which they carburized themselves in clay crucibles. Hundreds of layers pressed into a single monolith under a merciless hail of hammer blows and then brutally twisted in a vise while the metal glowed bright orange, created a fascinating spiral pattern on the surface. Now covered with a dull gray-black scale, they looked inconspicuous, like dead, rusty scrap. But Bjorn, thanks to his scientific background, saw something more in them. He saw architecture at the sub-microscopic level. He saw strands of martensite and pearlite wrapping around soft, shock-absorbing ferrite cores, a network of crystalline dislocations that were locked and trapped within the structure, ready to give the future blade incredible resilience. Eric placed his heavy, calloused hand on the bars, and his fingers traced the twisted texture with the tenderness with which a blind man reads the most beautiful.
Chapter 8. The Serpent's Kiss. The heavy, glowing billet of pattern-welded steel, a dense culmination of countless hours of meticulous folding, fluxing, and striking, rested upon the scarred face of the ancient anvil like a captured fragment of a dying star. Bjorn stood over it, his chest heaving, his muscles screaming in silent protest against the immense physical toll the forge had already demanded of his body. The transition from the delicate, almost surgical process of forge welding the intricate layers of high and low carbon steel to the brutal, unforgiving task of shaping the final blade had officially begun. The sheer mass of the glowing iron required a ferocious amount of kinetic energy to move, yet every single hammer blow had to be calculated with absolute, uncompromising precision. If he struck too hard, or at the wrong angle, the immense shearing forces would rip the delicate microscopic welds apart, destroying weeks of painstaking, back-breaking labor in a single devastating instant.
The chiaroscuro lighting of the forge, dominated by the blinding, fiery oranges and yellows of the glowing steel, contrasting against the deep, impenetrable charcoal shadows of the rough-hewn stone walls, cast long, dancing silhouettes that seemed to amplify his anxiety. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning coal, sulfur, and the salty sting of his own sweat, creating a suffocating yet profoundly intoxicating atmosphere. He tightened his grip on the smooth, worn grain of the hickory hammer handle, feeling the familiar, reassuring texture against his blistered palms. He raised the heavy steel hammer high above his head, pausing for a fraction of a second at the apex of the swing to align his body, his mind, and his spirit with the geometric center of the glowing billet. When the hammer finally descended, it struck the steel with a deafening, percussive roar, sending a spectacular shower of bright, incandescent orange sparks flying across the darkened room like miniature supernovas. The metal yielded slightly under the immense pressure, the complex layers compressing and elongating, taking the very first tentative step toward becoming a weapon of legendary historical status. Drawing out the distal taper involved fundamentally altering the raw geometry of the massive steel block into something resembling a sleek, lethal instrument of war. The hammer fell in hypnotic, punishing rhythm, a percussive symphony that echoed endlessly through the rough-hewn stone walls of the isolated forge. Bjorn had to constantly monitor the temperature of the steel, knowing that hammering the metal when it was too cold would invite disastrous microscopic fractures that would remain hidden until the blade shattered in combat. He worked the steel only when it glowed with a vibrant, pliable orange-red heat, swiftly returning it to the roaring coals the moment the color faded to a dull, angry cherry. The physical physics of moving mass from the thick central core down toward what would eventually become the needle-sharp point required a mastery of angles and striking force that bordered on the mathematical. With every resounding clang of the hammer against the anvil, thousands of delicate flakes of oxidized black scale broke loose from the surface of the glowing iron, cascading down into the deep shadows of the dirt floor like heavy metallic snow. The constant gnawing fear that a single off-center strike could cause a catastrophic delamination fueled Bjorn's adrenaline, keeping his mind razor-sharp even as his shoulders burned with exhaustion. He could almost feel the microscopic layers of alternating high-carbon and nickel-rich low-carbon steel stretching and thinning beneath his blows, an invisible subterranean dance of molecules dictated by the brutal kinetic force of his arm. The ambient temperature of the small room soared, pushing his physical endurance to its absolute limits, yet he refused to slow his pace, trapped in a flow state where the outside world ceased.
Chapter 9. The Brittle Replication.
A cool Scandinavian morning entered Alistair Finch's workshop, bringing with it the smell of damp pines and the promise of scientific triumph as the blacksmith reverently unwrapped heavy packages wrapped in oiled paper that had just arrived from the steelworks. There was no room for doubt in his mind. After all, he was a man of the 21st century, an engineer armed with knowledge that the ancients could only dream of, and in front of him lay perfectly cut, shiny ingots of modern steel alloys, shining with a cold, sterile glow under the influence of fluorescent lights. Finch ordered 1095 high-carbon steel and 15 N20 nickel alloy steel, materials with such a precisely controlled chemical composition that each batch was accompanied by a laboratory certificate of analysis guaranteeing the absolute absence of impurities, minimal sulfur and phosphorus content, and a perfect homogeneous crystal structure. He believed with the full conviction of a modern rationalist that the elimination of variables was the key to success, that the Vikings created their legendary knotted swords by struggling with primitive, dirty materials, and that with absolutely pure steel, he would create a blade that would surpass the original in every possible physical and mechanical respect.
The smooth, scale-free surface of the ingot seemed almost arrogant in its perfection, devoid of any organic history, resembling the components of a precision surgical instrument rather than the raw material for forging a deadly weapon from the Dark Ages. But Finch saw it only as a promise of absolute control over the metallurgical process. Preparations for the first weld were more like a rigorous protocol in a chemical laboratory than the traditional soot and smoke-filled work of a blacksmith, as Finch obsessively cut the bars into even pieces, ensuring that each edge was perfectly perpendicular and free of any microscopic burrs. Using a powerful belt sander, he stripped the top layer of metal from each piece to a mirror-like shine to make absolutely sure that not a speck of oxygen or the smallest speck of dust was trapped between the layers of alternating carbon and nickel steel that could weaken the future weld. He relied on the detailed records of Victorian antiquarians and early metallurgists who were the first to try to decipher the mystery of the so-called Damascus steel, carefully planning the process of folding, welding, cutting, and twisting the bundle, believing that the mechanical repetition of these geometric operations on a modern, perfect material would automatically result in the legendary, indestructible blade. Before placing the carefully vice-pressed bundle into the furnace, he washed it abundantly with acetone, removing even the invisible traces of grease from his own fingers, completely rejecting the dirty, instinctive chaos of the old forges in favor of a merciless, clinical sterility that would guarantee him a perfect combination of materials at the molecular level. As the massive gas furnace came to life with a deafening, chest-vibrating roar, and the blue propane flames began licking the ceramic fiber insulation, the light in the workshop dramatically transformed, replacing the cool colors of morning with a deep, predatory chiaroscuro of liquid fire and pitch black. Finch waited until the thermocouple read exactly 1,250 degrees Celsius, the optimal welding temperature based on iron-carbon charts. Then he pulled out the package, glowing a blinding bright yellow, and carried it under the enormous pneumatic compressor hammer that was to replace the muscles of a dozen medieval apprentices. Each blow of the powerful hammer shook the foundations of the Swedish workshop, raining down golden, sparkling drops of molten flux, while Finch, with
Chapter 10. The Earth's Offering. Alistair Finch stood in the heart of his university laboratory, surrounded by the symphony of sterile perfection that had defined his academic career for years, feeling the growing weight of his own hypocrisy. The cool bluish light of powerful fluorescent lamps reflected off pristine steel countertops on which rested precision electron microscopes, digital pyrometers accurate to a fraction of a degree, and complex mass spectrometers ready to dissect any material entrusted to them in a fraction of a second to its basic atomic components, stripping it of any mystery. In the corner of the room, a modern, powerful gas furnace hummed quietly, almost imperceptibly, a device capable of instantly reaching and maintaining extreme temperatures with almost mathematical accuracy, powered by an endless liquid stream of pure propane, leaving behind neither an ounce of acrid ash nor an unpredictable sticky slack. It was an absolute realm of complete control, the ultimate triumph of modern soulless science over the chaotic, wild nature of matter, a safe place where Alistair spent decades painstakingly studying ancient metallurgical techniques from the safe, numbing, almost arrogant distance of a microscope slide. But today, as he looked at this triumph of technology, he felt only a growing, suffocating emptiness in his chest, a growing and impossible to ignore conviction that his research to date, while impeccable in its rigorous methodology, was at its core completely dead, brutally devoid of soul and that raw primordial context from which the ancient craft had sprung.
The decision that had been slowly but inexorably brewing in him for many long months finally took the form of a final, radical, and irreversible decision that would be immediately, without a shadow of a doubt, recognized by his respected colleagues from the Faculty of History and Material Science as a manifestation of progressive clinical madness, or at least a deep pathological midlife crisis. Fully aware of his actions, he ignored samples of modern carbon steel arranged in perfect symmetrical order, ordered yesterday straight from an automated steelworks, perfectly clean, chemically homogeneous, and completely devoid of any history of their own. And instead, with determination, he reached for objects that, in this sterile, technologically advanced environment, looked as if they had been pulled from another brutal era. An old, heavy shovel covered with a layer of rust, slick with sweat, a rough wooden handle, two of the cheapest crude plastic buckets, the sides of which were already badly scratched from sharp sand and stones, and a pair of massive thick rubber galoshes, from the soles of which dried ash-gray flakes of mud from previous much less radical field trips were still falling off onto the sterile floor. As he hurried out of the building, past Dr. Aris Thorne, his longtime cynical colleague and chief, often ruthless opponent in fierce academic debates, in the long, shiny corridor, he heard behind him only a contemptuous, condescending snort and a mocking question as to whether the famous Professor Finch was going to play in the suburban mud like a little child again, instead of finally finishing and publishing his long-overdue peer-reviewed article on structure, crystallography of early medieval Iron Age blades. Alistair did not stop even for a split second, did not turn his head, and did not try to explain to him what suddenly became painfully clear to him, that to truly, thoroughly understand the nature of real steel, you can not only look at it through the crystalline lenses of equipment worth several dozen $1,000s, you have to take the risk and feel its bloody birth firsthand. You have to go back to the uncomfortable, brutal.
Chapter 11. Echoes in the Falling Hammer. The raw, smelted iron lay on Finch's anvil like a lump of meteorite that had just fallen from the sky, full of hidden potential and ancient secrets. The man stared at the porous, irregular surface of the metal, stroking it with his fingertips, searching for the smallest cracks and imperfections. The air in his modern workshop was thick with the smell of ozone, grinding dust, and burnt coal, creating an atmosphere of almost sacred concentration. He gently picked up one of the pieces and brought it close to the rapidly rotating grinder disc. The beam of sparks that erupted in a split second told him the entire chemical history of this fragment. Short, branching flashes like stars indicated the high carbon content necessary to create a hard cutting edge. In the same split second, as if connected by an invisible thread of time, the film narrative smoothly moves 1,000 years back into a smoky Viking forge bathed in deep shadows on the shore of an icy fjord. There, Bjorn, his face smeared with soot and sweat, was performing the exact same sorting process. However, he did not have high-speed grinders at his disposal and relied solely on brute force, breaking smaller bars with blows of a heavy hammer and analyzing the grain structure at the point of breakage. His trained eye, sharpened by years of study under Master Eric, was able to distinguish between soft, malleable iron with a large, light grain and hard, brittle steel with a structure resembling fine gray sand. The chiaroscuro of lighting in Bjorn's forge, where the only source of light was the pulsating heart of the hearth, created an aura of a mystical craftsman around him. The two men, separated by millennia and a technological gulf, divided matter with the same reverence into what would become the flexible core and what would become the deadly blade. As the furnaces in both worlds began to roar at full power, fueled by pressurized air, the temperature in both rooms increased dramatically, forcing the metal into submission. Finch used a modern electric blower whose steady, high-pitched hum filled the workshop, while in the Viking Age, powerful leather bellows moved rhythmically by a young apprentice made deep, wheezing sounds, reminiscent of the breathing of a trapped dragon. Heated to a bright cherry red, then to a blinding yellow-white, the iron was drawn onto the anvil with a furious hiss. Then the real physical dance began.
The camera, using split-screen technology, showed both blacksmiths performing identical, perfectly synchronized movements. The sound of Finch's hammer blows, the sharp, ringing echo against the steel surface of a modern anvil, gradually began to blend and then completely merge with the deep, guttural and raw clatter of Bjorn's iron hammer. It was no longer just a montage, it was a musical and visual symphony of work, where each blow deformed the matter in exactly the same way, throwing identical cascades of golden sparks into the air, which slowly fell to the ground like a shower of shooting stars. The process of drawing and forming the bars required superhuman effort and murderous precision, which with each blow took an increasing toll on the bodies of both craftsmen. Sweat dripped down Finch's temples, stinging his eyes beneath his protective glasses, while Bjorn's muscles, glistening with moisture and coal dust, flexed to the limit with each swing. The visual style of the scene became extremely tangible, kinetic, and rough. Macro lenses recorded each scale of iron oxide separating from the heated metal and splintering with a hiss into the darkness. The viewer could almost feel the roughness of the hickory wood in Finch's hands and the deep, worn grain of Bjorn's ash handle from constant use. The color palette, dominated by earthy tones of rust, deep red.
Chapter 12. The Unwritten Thesis. The atmosphere within the forge was thick with the scent of hot iron, burnt linseed oil, and the sharp metallic tang of the etching acid, culminating in a sensory tapestry that Alistair Finch had breathed in for the better part of 2 decades. He stood perfectly still before his heavy wooden workbench, the only light source a solitary, low-hanging, incandescent bulb that cast dramatic chiaroscuro shadows across the room, leaving the corners of the workshop swallowed in deep charcoal darkness while fiercely illuminating the object resting on the anvil. It was finished. After weeks of relentless, bone-breaking physical labor and agonizing intellectual doubt, the sword blade was finally complete. It did not look like the sterile, hyper-polished replicas favored by Hollywood or modern commercial smiths. Instead, it possessed a profoundly organic, almost feral quality. The surface of the steel was slightly uneven, speaking to the rhythmic, brutal poetry of the handheld hammer, yet it was undeniably perfectly aligned, a masterpiece of metallurgical tension. As Finch shifted his weight, the dim amber light caught the acid-etched surface of the blade, revealing the deep, mesmerizing patterns of the pattern-welded core. It looked like an aerial view of a turbulent, dark river frozen in time, swirling with microscopic crystalline structures of high and low carbon steel. The earthy tones of rust, deep brown and forged black, contrasted violently with the bright silvery edges of the hardened cutting bevels. Finch ran his thumb over the flat of the blade, his heavily calloused and soot-stained skin dragging against the microscopic ridges of the pattern. He could feel the history in it, a tactile connection to the unknown Viking smiths who had hammered out the original artifact a millennium ago. This was not merely a weapon, it was a physical manifestation of an unwritten thesis, a metallurgical argument forged in fire and sweat rather than penned on sterile academic paper. His hands, scarred by sparks and aching from the relentless percussion of his trade, trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from the terrifying realization that he had actually achieved the theoretical structure he had spent his entire adult life chasing. The sheer weight of the moment threatened to crush him, but he forced himself to pull back, to transition from the intuitive artist of the anvil to the cold, calculating scientist of the laboratory. The documentation process was, if anything, more grueling than the forging itself, requiring an obsessive level of detail that Finch pursued with manic dedication. He moved through the shadows of his workshop like a specter, adjusting a battery of high-definition digital cameras and macro lenses that stood on stark black tripods like mechanical sentinels. Every angle, every microscopic reflection of the steel's grain had to be captured, immortalized in high-resolution data before the impending test could potentially destroy it all.
He had filled 4 thick, leather-bound notebooks with frantic, charcoal-smudged handwriting, detailing every temperature fluctuation, every hammer blow, every chemical bath, and every subtle change in the metal's acoustic resonance. The contrast between the ancient elemental dirt of the forge and the sleek, cold precision of the camera lenses mirrored Finch's own dual existence. He spent hours agonizing over the lighting, ensuring that the camera sensors could pick up the subtle transitions between the pearlite and martensite structures within the etched steel, the very structures he believed gave the legendary swords their mythical flexibility. He was essentially preparing a defense for a trial where he was both the defendant and the prosecution, knowing that the academic world would tear his methodology apart if there was even a single undocumented variable. The red recording lights of the cameras blinked rhythmically, a digital heartbeat in the dusty gloom, capturing the raw, unpolished.
Chapter 13. The Last Word. Ominous, leaden clouds swirled low over the harsh landscape of the Viking settlement, choking out the remnants of the pale winter light that desperately tried to break through the thick curtain of smoke rising from dozens of large fires, creating an almost apocalyptic landscape. The atmosphere in the village was thick, heavy, and almost tangible, permeated with the suffocating but very familiar smell of burning, resinous pine wood, iron heated to a blinding redness, raw, wet wool from sheep's coats, sweat of nervously waiting people, and the sharp metallic smell of salt and seaweed carried by the merciless wind from the foaming sea. The entire clan, all the families, from the youngest, terrified children clinging to their mothers' thick, rusty-brown skirts, to the oldest, gray-haired veterans, their faces scarred as deep as fjords from countless battles, gathered in the central square. They formed a tight ring, pulsating with extreme emotions, around the packed frozen ground, which on this frosty evening was to become the arena of the most important test of their generation, a test that would decide the future of blacksmithing in their community. Fires from massive tar-covered hearths danced wildly in the gusting wind, casting long, dramatic, deep coal shadows across the rough wooden walls of nearby longhouses, highlighting the intricate grain textures of the old wood. This lighting, reminiscent of the dark canvases of masters of the chiaroscuro technique, created a visual spectacle straight from the darkest myths, in which fiery oranges, yellows, and gold fought with the all-consuming, cool darkness of the night in an eternal, brutal dance of the elements. The ground under their heavy leather boots was as hard as solid stone, and the uneven mud, covered with fierce frost, was an unforgiving, cold reminder of the severity and ruthlessness of the world in which they had to exist, where any weakness, even the slightest, meant instant death, and the indomitable strength of material and spirit was absolutely the only guarantee of surviving another harsh winter. In the distance, beyond the palisade that protected the settlement, one could hear the constant, rhythmic, powerful crashing of the icy, dark blue waves of the fjord, crashing furiously against the steep, jagged granite rocks. And this sound, like the beating of the gigantic, dark heart of the earth itself, counted down the seconds until the final resolution of the dispute between the two masters of the blacksmith's hammer. People whispered nervously to each other, sharing their fears and predictions, and their rapid, hot breaths immediately turned into thick, white clouds of swirling steam that were blown away in a split second by the icy north wind, which only added to the overall feeling of unbearable tension, deep anxiety, and reverent, almost religious reverence for the ancient craft of metal shaping.
every microscopic detail of their modest clothing, from the rough, scratchy textures of the thick rust-colored leather coats draped over broad shoulders, through the intricately carved bone clasps that had yellowed over time, to the shiny, massive, forged bronze brooches reflecting the glow of the flames, clearly testified to the existence of a culture that valued absolute craftsmanship, precision, and superhuman endurance of matter in the direct face of the destructive, powerful forces of brutal nature and the bloody, merciless reality of war, in which the sword was an extension of the arm and soul of the warrior. Suddenly, the noise of conversation ceased as the mighty and awe-inspiring figure of the Jarl, the ruler of these lands, a man whose word was law and whose anger heralded inevitable doom, emerged from the largest house. Dressed in unimaginably thick, dark bear furs that seemed to absorb the light around him, the Jarl walked slowly, with majestic dignity, each step echoing dully in the sudden, terrifying.
Chapter 14. The Bend That Doesn't Break.
In the sterile, cool interior of the conference room of the Copenhagen Archaeological Institute, there was a silence so thick and oppressive that it seemed to absorb every single sound, from the monotonous hum of advanced air conditioning equipment to the accelerated, restless heartbeats of the world's leading scientists gathered there. This space, dominated by cool analytical shades of laboratory blue and surgical sterile gray, was a drastic, almost painful contrast to what was shown by the huge panoramic screen hanging on the main central wall of the auditorium. This screen, emitting bright light, was a kind of window to a completely different dimension, a raw, brutal world, full of ubiquitous rust, charcoal dust swirling in the air and dying fire, where ancient, forgotten craftsmanship collided in real time with the merciless, measurable precision of modern materials engineering. Eva Lindholm, the distinguished archaeologist and relentless initiator of this globally unprecedented experiment, sat in the middle of the front row, her hands gripping the sharp edge of the laminate counter with such desperate force that her knuckles turned completely white and her nails were almost digging into the hard surface of the table. Her face, illuminated only by the cold bluish glow emanating from the giant monitor, was a mask of absolute unwavering concentration, beneath which hid an internal tension capable of crumbling solid granite. Each breath seemed to force its way through her constricted throat, and her wide-open eyes, glazed over with unexpressed emotions, barely blinked, staring as if in a trance at the live broadcast from Alistair Finch's gloomy workshop hundreds of miles away. Around her, on ergonomic modern armchairs, the greatest minds in the field of historical metallurgy, experimental archaeology, and materials engineering, people with outstanding scientific achievements who have spent decades researching Viking culture and scrupulously analyzing their military technology, froze in complete stillness, synchronously holding their breath while waiting for the result of a physical test that had the potential to, in a split second, forever, irrevocably change the content of academic textbooks' history. No one in the entire room dared to speak. No one wanted to break this almost pious, sacred silence, even with the slightest whisper or rustle of clothes, in which the fate of the controversial theory, which until recently was considered by the scientific community as pure, absurd heresy, was hanging in the balance. For many years, they were all told during university lectures that the Vikings were only primitive, bloodthirsty warriors from the north who could only hit a piece of polluted iron heated in a fire with a blunt hammer. But what they all now looked at in suspense threatened to completely destroy this existing, fundamental belief and show the ancient blacksmiths as highly refined, brilliant material engineers whose vast, complex knowledge, although never recorded in any books or parchments, was extremely deeply rooted in their intuition, empirical experience, and craftsman's genius.
The tension in the spacious room was growing at an avalanche pace with each passing fractional second, and the blue light of the screen cast long, dramatic, unnatural shadows on the scientists' faces, making them look like motionless, ancient sculptures, forever frozen in time in the moment of the greatest existential expectation of the final verdict that was to inevitably come from this distant place saturated with darkness, soot, and the smell of burning iron, a workshop where a modern master blacksmith prepared in absolute silence to subject his latest, greatest creation to the final, brutal, and potentially devastating.
Chapter 15. The Journey into Silence. The transition from the sweltering, soot-stained confines of Bjorn's forge to the harsh, unforgiving daylight of the Nordic world marked the true genesis of the blade's long journey into the annals of blood and silence. When the massive smith finally presented his masterpiece, the weapon was a thing of terrifying, pristine beauty, its surface a hypnotic tapestry of rippling steel forged from the very bones of the earth. The Jarl's son, a youth whose hands were still smooth and largely untouched by the brutal realities of war, reached out to take the hilt with a mixture of profound reverence and poorly concealed trepidation. The camera lingers in a slow, deliberate macro shot on the exact moment of transfer, capturing the stark textural contrast between Bjorn's heavily calloused, charcoal-dusted fingers and the pale, unscarred skin of the young warrior. As the heavy sword settles into its new master's grip, the light catches the intricate, pattern-welded core, revealing microscopic crystalline structures in the high-carbon steel that shimmer with an almost liquid vitality. The chiaroscuro lighting of the forge, with its deep, impenetrable shadows and the fiery, dying orange embers in the background, serves as a dramatic canvas for the gleaming metal. This is a weapon born of fire and immense physical suffering, an elemental force wrestled into a deadly geometric perfection. The leather-wrapped wooden grip, perfectly tailored to a man's hand, squeaks faintly under the tightening grip of the youth, a tactile sound that underscores the immense metaphysical weight of the object. It is no longer just a piece of worked iron. It is a destiny made manifest, an instrument of authority that carries the heavy expectations of a bloodline and the unspoken promise of impending violence. The air around them seems to hum with the lingering resonance of the anvil, a silent vibration that ties the creator to the wielder in a temporary, fragile bond before the sword steps fully into the chaotic, brutal theater of the Viking Age. Scarcely a month had passed before the pristine, intricate patterns of the newly forged steel tasted the chaotic, visceral horror of their first genuine battle, plunging into the claustrophobic nightmare of the shield wall. The sensory overload of the battlefield was absolute, a maelstrom of screaming men, the dull, sickening thud of axes biting into lindenwood, and the metallic shrieks of deflected blades. In the hands of the Jarl's son, the sword became an incredibly efficient instrument of destruction, its perfectly honed edge slicing through boiled leather and flesh with a horrifying, frictionless ease. The cinematic lens captures the grim reality of the combat in stark, high-contrast chiaroscuro, where the pale, overcast sky occasionally fractures to let a brilliant shaft of sunlight illuminate the swirling dust and the fine mist of arterial blood. We see the sword in terrifying motion, a flash of patterned gray steel that cuts through the earthy, muddy tones of the battlefield like a stroke of localized lightning. The pristine surface of the blade is quickly compromised, smeared with thick, crimson ribbons that pool in the microscopic valleys of the pattern-welded etchings, forever altering its virgin state. The camera focuses on the tactile brutality of the engagement, the splintering of wooden shields spraying jagged shrapnel into the air, the heavy spray of mud as boots struggle for traction on the slick, blood-soaked grass, and the terrifying, intimate proximity of desperate men fighting for their lives.
With every thrust and parry, the sword proves the absolute mastery of Bjorn's craft, absorbing the tremendous kinetic shocks of combat without bending or breaking, its springy core flexing infinitesimally to dissipate the energy of impact. The young wielder's face is a mask of pure adrenaline-fueled survival, his earlier trepidation replaced by the primal, intoxicating power granted by the peerless weapon.
Chapter 16. The Unwritten Science.
The biting, salt-laced wind off the Baltic Sea whipped fiercely against Alistair Finch as he walked the final heavy steps toward the imposing, brutalist facade of the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen, carrying an armored pelican case that felt as though it contained the sheer gravitational weight of his entire existence. The journey to this exact geographical and temporal coordinate had not been measured merely in miles or flight hours, but in months of relentless, flesh-searing heat, the deafening and rhythmic concussions of a heavy forging hammer against a steel anvil, and an exhaustive series of catastrophic, heartbreaking failures that had tested the very limits of his physical endurance and psychological resolve. Entering through the grand, heavy glass doors of the museum, Finch experienced a jarring, almost violent sensory transition. The chaotic, raw, and elemental world of his dark, smoke-choked forge, a realm defined by the primal forces of roaring fire, choking coal dust, and the pungent, metallic scent of hot iron, was instantly replaced by the hyper-controlled, impeccably sterile, and profoundly silent environment of one of the world's premier historical preservation facilities. The climate-controlled air inside was remarkably crisp, smelling faintly of ozone and industrial cleaning solvents, a stark contrast to the sweat and sulfur that had embedded themselves deep into his pores over the past year. As his heavy boots echoed against the polished, unyielding concrete floors, casting long, dramatic, chiaroscuro shadows under the precisely angled architectural lighting, Finch felt a profound sense of anticipation welling up within his chest. The heavy black plastic case swinging methodically by his side was not just a container, it was a physical manifestation of a singular obsession, a meticulously crafted bridge across a millennium of forgotten metallurgical history, holding within its velvet-lined interior the shining culmination of an ancient, unwritten science that he was finally ready to lay bare before the uncompromising altar of modern analytical scrutiny. Descending deep into the subterranean levels of the museum, Finch was guided by security personnel through a labyrinth of heavily secured corridors until he finally arrived at the primary metallurgical preservation laboratory, a room that looked less like an archaeological workspace and more like a surgical theater poised on the bleeding edge of futuristic technology. Waiting for him amidst the hum of sophisticated environmental controls and the cool, sterile glow of blue-tinted computer monitors was Dr. Eva Lindholm, a brilliant archaeometallurgist whose sharp, analytical demeanor was perfectly balanced by an unmistakable, deep-seated reverence for the silent artifacts of antiquity. The laboratory itself was a masterclass in modern utilitarian design, defined by stark, brushed stainless steel surfaces, brilliant, unforgiving white LED overhead lights that banished all shadows to the absolute corners of the room, and the soft, rhythmic hum of high-voltage equipment standing ready to dissect the secrets of the past. Without a word, acknowledging the solemnity of the moment with a brief, respectful nod, Finch hoisted the heavy case onto the expansive central examination table. The sharp, metallic clack of the heavy-duty latches echoing through the silent room sounded remarkably like the cocking of a massive firearm. As Finch slowly raised the lid, the harsh laboratory lights cascaded down upon the velvet interior, immediately catching and refracting off the pristine, heavily etched surface of his meticulously pattern-welded replica. The blade seemed to hum with an innate, dormant power,
its complex, swirling Damascus-like patterns of high and low carbon steel standing out in brilliant, violent contrast, a chaotic yet mathematically beautiful storm of bright silver and deep, abyssal charcoal gray. Ava stepped closer, her eyes widening infinitesimally.